He had his son with him, a fine young squire, a lover and cadet, a lad of fire, with locks as curly as if they had been pressed. He was some 20 years of age, I guessed. In his stature, he was of moderate length, with wonderful agility and strength. He had seen some service with the cavalry in Flanders and Artois and Picardy, and had done valiantly in little space of time, and hoped to win his lady's grace. He was embroidered like a meadow bright, and full of freshest flowers, red and white. Singing he was, or fluting all the day, he was as fresh as is the month of May. Short was his gown, the sleeves were long and wide. He knew the way to sit a horse and ride. He could make songs and poems and recite, knew how to joust and dance, to draw and write. He loved so hotly that till dawn grew pale, he slept as little as a nightingale. Courteous he was, lowly and serviceable, and carved to serve his father at the table. There was a yeoman with him at his side, no other servant, so he chose to ride. This yeoman wore a coat and a hood of green, and peacock-feathered arrows, bright and keen, and neatly sheathed hung at his belt, while for he could dress his gear in yeoman style, his arrows never drooped their feathers low, and in his hand he bore a mighty bow. His head was like a nut, his face was brown, he knew the whole of woodcraft up and down. A saucy brace was on his arm to ward it from the bowstring, and a shield and a sword hung at one his side, and at the other slipped a jaunty dirk, spear sharp and well equipped. A medal of St. Christopher he wore on shining silver on his breast, and he bore a hunting horn, well slung and burnished clean, that dangled from a baldric of bright green. He was a proper forester, I guess. There's also a nun, a prioress, her way of smiling very simple and a coy. Her greatest oath was only by St. Loy, well she known as Madame Eglantine. She sang a service with fine intoning through her nose. She was most seemly, and she spoke daintily in French extremely. After the school of Stratford at Bow, French in the Paris style she did not know. At meat her manners were well taught with all. No morsel from her lips did she let fall, nor dipped her fingers in the sauce too deep, but she could carry a morsel up, and keep the smallest drop from falling on her breast. For courtliness she had a special zest, and she would wipe her upper lips so clean that not a trace of grease was to be seen. Upon the cup where she had drunk to eat, she reached a hand sedately for the meat. She certainly was very entertaining, pleasant and friendly in her ways, and straining to counterfeit a courtly kind of peace, a stately bearing fitting to her place, and to seem dignified in all her dealings. As for her sympathies and tender feelings, she was so charitably solicitous, she used to weep if she but saw a mouse caught in a trap, if it were dead or bleeding. And she had little dogs that she would be feeding with roasted flesh, or milk, or fine white bread, and she bitterly wept if one were dead, or someone took a stick and made it smart. She was all sentiment and tender heart. Her veil gathered in a seemly way, her nose was elegant, her eyes a glass gray. Her mouth was very small, but soft and red. Her forehead certainly was fair and spread, almost span across the eyebrows, I own. She was indeed by no means undergrown. Her cloak, I noticed, had graceful charm. She wore a coral trinket on her arm. A set of beads, the gaudy tricked in green, whence hung a golden brooch of brightest sheen, on which there first was graven, crowned, A, and lower, Amor Vincit Omnia. Another nun, chaplain at her cell, was riding with her, and 3 priests as well. A monk there was, one of the finest sort, who rode the country hunting. What hunting was a sport, A manly man, to be an abbot able, many a dainty horse he had in his stable. His bridle, when he rode, a man might hear jingling in a whistling wind as clear. Aye, and as loud as does the chapel bell where my lord monk was prior of the cell. The good rule of Saint Benet or Saint Mar, as old and strict he tended to ignore. He let go by the things of yesterday, and took the modern world's more spacious way. He did not rate that text of the plucked hen, which says that hunters are not only men, and that a monk uncloistered is a mere fish out of water, flapping on the pier. That is to say, a monk out of his cloister. That was a text he held, not worth an oyster. And I agreed, and said his views were sound. Was he to study till his head went round, poring over books and cloisters? Must he toil, as Austin bade, until the very soil? Was he to leave the world upon the shelf? Let Austin have his labor to himself. This monk was therefore a good man to horse. Greyhounds he had, as swift as birds to course. Hunting a hare or riding at a fence was all his fun, he spared for no expense. I saw his sleeves were garnished at the hand with fine grey fur, finest in the land, and on his hood to fasten it at his chin he had wrought golden cunningly fashioned pin. Into a lover's knot it seemed to pass. His head was bald and shone like looking glass. So did his face, as if it had been greased. He was fat and personable priest. His eyes, his prominent eyeballs, never seemed to settle. They glittered like flames beneath the kettle. Supple his boots, his horse in fine condition. He was a prelate fixed for exhibition. He was not pale, like a tormented soul. He liked a fat swan best and roasted whole. His palfrey was as brown as is a berry. There was a friar, a wanton, one and merry, a limiter, a very festive fellow. In all four orders there was none so mellow, so glib with gallant phrase and well-turned speech. He'd fixed up many a marriage, giving each of his young women what he could afford her. He was a noble pillar to his order. Highly beloved and intimate was he with country folk, with his boundary, and city dames of honor and possessions, for he was qualified to hear confessions, or so he said, with more than priestly scope. He had a special license from the Pope. Sweetly he heard his penitence at shrift, with pleasant absolution for a gift. He was an easy man in penance giving, where he could hope to make a decent living. It's a sure sign, whenever gifts are given to poor order, that man's well shriven. And should he give enough, he knew in verity, the penitent repented in sincerity. For many a fellow is so hard of heart, he cannot weep for all his inward smart. Therefore, instead of weeping and of prayer, one should give silver for a poor friar's cure. He kept his tippet stuffed with pins for curls, and pocket knives to give to pretty girls. And certainly his voice was gay and sturdy, for he sang well and played the hurdy-gurdy. At sing-songs he was champion of the hour. His neck was whiter than a lily flower, but strong enough to butt a bruiser down. He knew the taverns well in every town, and every innkeeper and barmaid too. Better than lepers, beggars, and that crew. For in so eminent a man as he, it was not fitting with the dignity of his possession, dealing with scum of wretched lepers. Nothing good can come of dealings with the slum and gutter dwellers, but only with the rich and victual sellers.